Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Opera 101 with Cleveland Opera Theater. Opera 101 is our Monday through Friday series where we talk about all things opera and take you through this strange yet wonderful world in which we all function. Today, I would like to do a little talk about one of my favorite composers, Gioachino Rossini. Rossini is an interesting character in opera. He is not a person about whom a ton is written. He didn't have the tragic life that you associate with a lot of composers like Mahler or Beethoven. He was raised in a musical family, had a very great talent from the beginning, and he lived a pretty successful life. The most interesting thing about his career is he retired from opera composing at the age of 37. Now, there are a lot of speculations as to why. A lot of people, he was not in the greatest health then, and by the time he recovered, he was pretty much just in to the mindset of, I did my work, I'm just going to throw lavish parties and cook for my friends. He was so successful and had attained essentially what we would call today rock star status by then, that he composed a few pieces. He wrote his Stabat Mater, his Petite Messe Solenne, more serious sacred pieces, and a few song cycles, but largely after the age of 37, his opera composing days were done. In fact, some people somewhat facetiously refer to Rossini as, in addition to the composer, the world's first celebrity chef, as that was his reputation then. Today, though, I think we're going to talk a little bit less about Rossini the person and a little more about the Rossini the composer. In certain circles, Rossini, I believe, kind of gets a bad rap and doesn't get the respect that he deserves in terms of what he contributed to the musical world. He's often touted as merely a commercial composer, someone who was formulaic, did the same things, just composed to make money. Yes, he was very successful and he did follow certain formulas. He was notorious for reusing material. There's an old joke that Beethoven wrote 5 overtures for one opera and Rossini used the same overture for 5 operas, which is largely true. A lot of his most famous overtures, like The Barber of Seville or La Cenerentola, were not actually composed for those operas. They were composed for previous operas, and he just reused them. Hence why you don't hear any of the themes from Barber of Seville in the Barber of Seville overture. It was originally composed for a different opera, as were several of his overtures. However, it's worth taking a look at what Rossini did to kind of change the opera world. And I think first is the way he wrote for the voice and the voice types he used. The heroes or the protagonists in Rossini's operas are typically the tenor and the mezzo-soprano. This was a bit of a departure from the opera trends. In the early days of opera, the Baroque era, the male heroine was usually sung by a castrato, which, as the name suggests, was a castrated male who was castrated before puberty to retain the high voice. This practice became illegal in the 18th century, and composers stopped writing for that voice type, and a lot of times the male heroine became the bass or the baritone. You think of like Mozart's Marriage of Figaro or Don Giovanni. The heroes are the bass or the baritone. There were a few with the tenor. Mozart definitely used that in Clemente di Tito and Magic Flute, but largely that wasn't the case. Rossini really codified the trend of the tenor as the male hero, which went through all opera after that. It's almost always the case. Also the mezzo soprano. If you look at any opera before Rossini, a mezzo was usually a very secondary character. And for Rossini, all the roles of Rosina in Barber of Seville, Cinderella in La Cenerentola, most of his famous female roles were sung by a mezzo. And this is very, this brought a lot of legitimacy to that role and created it as a vehicle for expression. The way Rossini wrote for the voice too is unlike anything before. The familiarity he had with it and the command he did started the era that we call bel canto, which means beautiful singing. And in Rossini's arias and duets, the singer has way more freedom and ability to show off their vocal technique than in most of the operas before. It was very common practice for the singer to ornament freely. The singers could make up their own variations. All of this was to create essentially this operatic freak show of, oh my gosh, look at what these people can do with their voice. And the later bel canto composers of Donizetti and Bellini really expanded upon this and used this to create a tradition in opera. This tradition kind of extended through the early days of Verdi and toward the latter part of the 19th century. It did move back, and singers, the tradition of ornamentation did kind of die out. It was really at its peak in kind of this early 19th century era with Rossini, Donizetti, and Bellini. Other musical things that Rossini is known for, the quote-unquote Rossini Crescendo, which we've all heard, and it's in almost every overture and most of the finale. Most of the finale to, especially his middle act finale, is the act 1 finale if it's a 2-act opera, or the act 2 finale if it's a 3-act opera, have what we call the Rossini Crescendo, which is basically the same passage of music repeated and getting louder by adding more instruments. So it starts very soft with only a few instruments in the orchestra playing, and it's repeated usually 3 times, each time a new set of instruments added in, and that creates the crescendo effect. It usually comes to a really big climax, and if there are any music theory inclined people listening, it ends with a big climax and usually a modulation to the mediant, the chromatic or diatonic mediant key. So that's a little just a little intro as to how some of the things that Rossini does, and we will come back with some more details later, but as always, thanks again for tuning in.